She walked quietly into the lecture hall, a simple woman in a grey cardigan and worn-out flats. No name tag, no entourage. Just a small spiral notebook tucked under one arm, and eyes that scanned the room like she'd been there before. No one paid her any real attention at first. The room was grand and cold, the kind of academic theatre where every polished surface reflected centuries of tradition and ego. Students in expensive jackets whispered across rows. Laptops open, coffee in hand, everyone was buzzing. Today's guest lecture was being delivered by none other than Professor Victor Langford-Dan, academic titan and head of mathematics at Texas State University. To be in that room meant you were either brilliant, privileged, or both. And then there was her. When Clara Bennett took a seat in the very back, several students noticed she wasn't dressed like them, she wasn't the right age, and she definitely didn't act like someone used to being in that kind of room. Two students sitting nearby exchanged a smirk. Is she auditing or lost? Maybe she's just here to clean up after the symposium, one of them whispered. They weren't entirely wrong. Clara did work for the university. Not in academics, not in research, she worked in facilities management, maintenance. 3 years of changing light bulbs and fixing leaky toilets for professors who rarely looked her in the eye. But Clara wasn't here today as an employee. She was here because something about this lecture about Riemann's hypothesis and its implications in quantum computing had kept her up for nights. She'd read the abstract posted on the university's online board. And while she didn't have a PhD, or even a bachelor's in mathematics, her mind hadn't stopped working since. Professor Langford entered, commanding the room with the gravitas of someone used to being the smartest man alive, silver beard trimmed, navy suit pressed to perfection. His gaze scanned the hall, then landed briefly on Clara. He gave a look just long enough to register disapproval, then looked away as if she were a smudge on glass. He began his lecture with flair, discussing symmetry matrices and transformation logic. Graduate students nodded furiously, some pretending to understand every word. Clara, meanwhile, listened. Really listened. Her eyes flickered as the numbers came alive in her mind. It had always been this way for her. She could feel the structure of equations the way musicians feel harmony. But then it happened. The room grew quiet as Langford stepped away from the projector and faced the audience. Let's open the floor. Any questions? Predictably, no one raised a hand. Langford didn't invite conversation, he invited intimidation. And then, almost involuntarily, Clara's hand lifted. She regretted it the second she did it. Too late. Every head turned. Even Langford paused, clearly thrown off. Yes, ma'am? He asked, his tone lined with condescension. You have a question? Clara cleared her throat. I was wondering about the variable transformation you applied in step 4. Wouldn't that create inconsistencies when it intersects with your boundary conditions? The room stiffened. That wasn't a question about coffee or air conditioning. That was deep math. Langford blinked, then smiled in the way people do when they think they've found an easy target. And you are? He asked. Clara Bennett. I work in facilities. A ripple of stifled laughter. Someone muttered, Of course she does. Langford's smile widened. Facilities? Fascinating. And yet you believe there's an issue with my work? Not an issue, she said quietly, just a potential conflict. The room held its breath. Well then, he said, gesturing to the chalkboard, perhaps our guest would like to demonstrate her insight. It wasn't a question, it was a trap. Clara froze. Her whole body wanted to shrink back into her chair, to disappear into the walls she cleaned every night. But something inside her, a quiet fury, or maybe just fatigue from years of being dismissed, pushed her forward. She stood up. The room watched with mild horror and morbid curiosity as she walked down the long center aisle. Langford stepped aside like a ringmaster inviting the clown into center stage. He handed her a piece of chalk with a flourish. Let's keep it simple, shall we? He said, turning to the board and writing a differential equation that would give most undergraduates a headache. Clara stared at it for a moment. Somewhere in the back, a voice whispered, This is going to be painful. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She picked up the chalk and took one step closer to the board. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to show them what they couldn't yet see. For a second, Clara Bennett stood still, chalk in hand, facing the equation like it was a wall she had scaled 1,000 times in her mind. Behind her, the room of graduate students sat in weighted silence, watching, judging, waiting to feel superior. But she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the numbers. Professor Langford leaned against the podium, arms crossed, wearing a smirk as sharp as his creased collar. "Take your time," he said, just loud enough to sound generous, and just quiet enough to humiliate. Clara ignored him. In her head, variables began to shift into place. She didn't just see equations, she felt them. She could sense where the function bent, where logic wanted to go but got tangled in ego. Her fingers twitched, remembering nights at the campus library after cleaning the lecture halls, reading abandoned journals and scribbling in margins no one would ever see. Now they would. She lifted her hand and made the first mark, clean, confident, a single Greek symbol. Then another. The line grew. Her handwriting wasn't elegant, but the math was. Slowly, rhythmically, she began to unwind the entire equation. At first, there were snickers, but then, nothing. The noise in the room faded into a stunned kind of silence, the kind people make when the thing they're mocking starts to glow. Clara worked methodically, pausing only to shift her stance. Her breathing slowed. The chalk clicked faintly against the board, each tap sharper than Langford's condescension. Her hand moved like it had rehearsed this 100 times. In a way, it had. By the time she reached the final line of simplification, a whisper passed through the front row, like static. "Wait, is that right?" She placed the chalk down and stepped away. Langford stood motionless. He blinked once, twice, then walked up to the board, as if trying to confirm what he was seeing wasn't an illusion. He scanned the work, then backtracked, his lips moving silently. It was flawless. "It's correct," he muttered. The room stirred. A few heads turned. A couple of students sat straighter. One began typing on a laptop, furiously trying to match what she'd written with what had just been presented. A quiet murmur rose uneasy, confused. She hadn't explained anything. She hadn't defended herself. She had just done it. Langford forced a smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "A lucky guess," he said, brushing chalk dust from his sleeve. "Let's try something, a bit more advanced, shall we?" He walked to the other side of the board and began scribbling a new equation. This time, there were no friendly symbols, no classroom examples. This was pure theoretical math, the kind of nightmare that earned tenure if you solved it, or ridicule if you tried. "This problem," he said, "has applications in quantum encryption. It's cutting-edge work not found in textbooks. Don't feel pressured, Miss Bennett. You're welcome to return to your seat." It was a challenge dressed up like a kindness. Clara didn't move. She looked at the board. The equation wasn't familiar, but the structure was. It reminded her of something she'd once read during her break on a library computer, a white paper on multidimensional encoding. She hadn't understood all of it then, but she remembered the shape of it, the logic beneath the jargon. She took a breath and picked up the chalk again. Someone in the audience sighed. Another whispered, "What is she doing?" But there was something different now. The mockery was quieter. Some of it was gone entirely. Because what Clara was doing didn't look random. It looked intentional. She began slow, mapping variables, identifying symmetry. Students leaned forward, craning to see. Even the ones who'd laughed earlier weren't smiling now. Langford, arms still crossed, said nothing. Then Clara did something unexpected. She paused halfway through and drew a diagonal slash across one term, a substitution no one had predicted, a redefinition that simplified the quantum variable set. A gasp from the front row. It came from Dr. Maya Brooks, a visiting professor from MIT, sitting silently until now. Her eyebrows rose. She whispered something to her colleague. They both stared at the board. "She's isolating the entangled variable," Dr. Brooks whispered. "I've never seen anyone do it that way." Langford heard it, his jaw clenched. Clara didn't hear anything. She was somewhere else now, in that quiet place where the world melted into abstraction and everything made sense. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about the beauty of clarity. The perfection of a pattern solved. She worked for 5 more minutes, 5 minutes that felt like hours. Then she stopped. The room didn't breathe. Clara stepped back, chalk dust on her fingertips, and stared at the board one final time. And then the silence broke. But not with clapping, with a whisper. That wasn't luck. Professor Victor Langford stood frozen. The chalk still in Clara's hand hadn't moved for over a minute, but no one said a word. Her final line sat on the board like a spark waiting to set fire to the entire room. It was the kind of solution that shouldn't have come from anyone, let alone from a woman in a grey cardigan who'd just admitted to working in facilities. Langford stepped forward, closer than before, eyes scanning her work like he was seeing another language. His fingers followed one of the transformations. His mouth twitched. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Dr. Maya Brooks rose slowly from the front row, her voice steady but loud enough to cut the silence. "That's the low Takahashi compression," she said, narrowing her eyes at Clara. But it was only published last month in a restricted mathematics journal. Now the room reacted. A second-year doctoral student turned in her seat. A visiting researcher from the University of Chicago dropped his pen. Someone whispered, "No way." Dr. Brooks walked toward the board. "How do you know this method?" she asked, her tone not accusing, just stunned. "That article hasn't been indexed yet. Even most faculty haven't read it." Clara stared down at her fingers, smudged with chalk, then back up at the board. "I don't know it by name," she said softly. "I read something similar on an open-source white paper a few weeks ago. It didn't quite make sense then, but I guess it stuck." "You guessed?" Langford scoffed. It was the first sound he'd made in minutes. "That transformation isn't even taught. It's theorized, barely proven." Clara turned to him now, meeting his eyes for the first time since the exchange began. "I didn't guess," she said evenly. "I just saw the pattern." That simple sentence landed like a thunderclap. "I just saw the pattern." Dr. Brooks stepped closer. "Do you have any formal mathematical training?" Clara hesitated. Every part of her wanted to shrink again to avoid sounding like she was trying to make a statement. But that moment had passed. She'd already made it. "I finished community college," she said. "Before that, I taught myself, mostly from textbooks people throw away." Langford exhaled, like he'd been holding in a laugh. "Impossible! You'd need a decade of specialized research just to—" "She did it," Dr. Brooks interrupted, still staring at the board. "Perfectly. I've seen postdocs fumble this equation. She just made it elegant." That word elegant landed hard. Langford said nothing. Dr. Brooks turned back to Clara. "Do you have more of this? Notes, notebooks, anything?" Clara gave a shy nod. "I write down ideas sometimes. At night. After work. I don't know if they're useful. Just things I think about." Langford looked like he was about to implode. "You expect us to believe someone with no credentials just walked in here and improved upon one of the most complex models in quantum encryption theory?" Dr. Brooks's voice sharpened. "Whether or not you believe her isn't the issue. She just did it." The tension in the room fractured. Students who had once chuckled now whispered furiously among themselves. Phones discreetly pointed toward the chalkboard. One even snapped a photo of Clara, as if they realized they were witnessing something historic. A student in the third row raised her hand, then put it down, then raised it again nervously. I just want to say, I've been working on quantum variance modeling for my thesis, and I've never seen a solution like that. This isn't just good, it's—" She struggled to find the word. "Inspiring." Clara's face flushed, but not from embarrassment this time, from something closer to being seen. Dr. Brooks turned to Langford, who was now pale and stiff. "Victor, if this isn't brilliance, I don't know what is." Langford stared at Clara for a long moment. "I underestimated you," he said finally. The words were stiff, forced. "It appears I was wrong." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing a man like him would ever say to one. Clara gave a small nod. "I've been underestimated before." Dr. Brooks stepped in again. "Clara, I'd like to see those notebooks, and I'd like to talk to you seriously about what comes next. MIT runs a fellowship program for independent researchers with unconventional paths, and you, clearly, belong in that category." Clara blinked, unsure if she'd heard her right. "MIT? You'd be surprised how many of our greatest minds didn't come through the front door," Dr. Brooks said, smiling. At the back of the room, the student who had called her a janitor now looked down at his shoes. Another one muttered, "I can't believe this." A different kind of silence fell. Not disbelief. Respect. The lecture hall had emptied over an hour ago, but Clara Bennett was still there alone now, standing quietly in front of the chalkboard that had just rewritten her life. Smudges of white dust coated her hands and sweater. Her fingers ached slightly from holding the chalk so long, but she didn't feel tired. She felt awake. A soft knock broke the silence. It was Dr. Maya Brooks, holding 2 cups of coffee and a look that was no longer analytical but warm. "I figured you haven't had lunch," she said. Clara smiled, accepting the cup. "Thank you. I don't really know what happens now." "You don't have to," Maya replied. "What matters is what happens next because of you." Clara looked down at the floor. "I've never thought of myself as someone people would want to learn from." Maya chuckled. "You didn't need to. Your work already spoke louder than credentials ever could." Across the room, Professor Langford remained behind, deep in tense conversation with the department chair. His tone was low, his expression taut. Occasionally he glanced toward Clara no longer dismissively, but with something closer to reluctant respect. Or was it fear? It didn't matter anymore. What Clara had done today wasn't about revenge or validation. She didn't need to win anyone's approval. She had simply shown up, done what she loved, and let her mind do the talking. And that was enough. As she gathered her things, a timid voice called from the hallway. "Miss Bennett?" It was a young woman, maybe 19, clutching a thick engineering textbook and nervously pushing her glasses up her nose. I just wanted to say thank you." Clara blinked. "For what?" The student stepped closer. "For proving that people like us belong here too. I'm the first in my family to go to college. I work nights in the dining hall. Sometimes I feel like I'm faking it. But what you did to date, reminded me why I started." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a quiet warmth, almost unbearable in its beauty. She didn't know her name, but she knew the feeling. The fight to stay visible in a place that wants to erase you. The instinct to stay small, quiet, unnoticeable. "Not anymore." She rested a hand gently on the student's arm. "Don't ever apologize for taking up space in a room you've earned." Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting a golden hue over the quad as Clara made her way toward the parking lot. Her phone buzzed, 5 missed calls from the babysitter. Real life, still waiting. Rent, groceries, shift schedules. But now, something else waited too. Hope. Later that evening, at home in her small apartment, Clara opened the drawer where she kept her notebooks, dozens of them, filled with equations, theories, sketches, years of quiet thinking. She ran her fingers over the spines. Tomorrow, those pages wouldn't just be scribbles. They'd be evidence. They'd be proof. They'd be a beginning. 6 months later, a smaller classroom, a newer chalkboard. But this time, Clara Bennett stood at the front. She wore the same grey cardigan but now. Its sleeves were pushed up confidently as she wrote across the board. The students before her listened intently as she explained a theorem that only a year ago she wouldn't have been qualified to speak on. 2 of her original theories had already been published. She was officially listed as a visiting fellow in an MIT-supported independent research program. Even Professor Langford, after several contentious faculty meetings, had conceded her work was of significant academic merit. He didn't call her Clara, but he no longer called her Mom either. The biggest change wasn't her title. It was the way she stood. No longer afraid to be seen. No longer apologizing for being exceptional. As she wrapped up the day's lecture, a student raised her hands softly, nervously. Clara recognized that look immediately, that hesitation, that fear of sounding stupid in a room full of noise. Clara smiled and nodded. "Yes?" The student asked a thoughtful, difficult question, one Clara herself had once feared to ask. She walked toward the desk and leaned forward gently. "Never be afraid to raise your hand," she told them. "The question you're afraid to ask might change everything, not just for you, but for everyone in the room. Greatness doesn't always wear a title. It doesn't need credentials to be real. Sometimes, the most brilliant minds walk among us quietly unnoticed until the day they stop shrinking to fit the world's expectations." She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. And from that day forward, no one ever mistook Clara Bennett for just the maintenance woman again.